Welcome back to the Impact Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host, sabinemprobst, nature conservation documentary filmmaker and NGO director. And today I'm joined by Annalise Nisly, a marine scientist whose work spans coral and sponge restoration, benthic ecology, and community driven conservation. With a bachelor's in environmental and marine science, she has carried her passion for ocean stewardship from the Florida Keys to East Africa. Whether leading divers into the world's first sponge restoration project, mapping vibrant reefs of Zanzibar, or cultivating thousands of corals in nursery systems, Annalise brings both scientific rigor and a deep care for the ecosystem and communities she serves. As a dive master with over 200 dives beneath the surface and a growing interest in social media communication, she hopes to document the progression of her career, particularly to increase diversity in the field and inspire those from diverse backgrounds that a career in marine science is possible. Before we jump into the conversation, if you enjoy the Impact Storytelling podcast and want to support it, you can now do so through Patreon. As a patron, you will get early access to upcoming guest announcements and the chance to submit your own questions for them. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's dive into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to explore the world of sponges and corals with you. How did your interest in marine biology first begin? Was there a moment or experience that drew you into the ocean world?
So I grew up really far away from the ocean, and my first exposure was through documentaries that my mom had rented from my local library. That was the first time I really got to see the underwater world. But it was in high school when we had an extracurricular marine biology class that I was able to take my first trip to the Florida Keys and see a coral reef with my eyes for the first time. So that was definitely like my first experience where I knew, oh wow, this is what I want to do. I had an idea prior that I really liked the idea of the ocean and I'd gone to the beach before, but I'd never gotten to be in the water in a more like serious way. And that all changed in high school.
And what led you specifically to become fascinated by sessile animals like sponges and corals rather than the more mobile marine life?
Yeah. Well, everybody loves a good dolphin or a good shark and turtle. They're very um charismatic. It's easy for people to connect with them. And I think that's why they get could be kind of the brand ambassadors for marine biology. But I really like biogenic habitats or habitats that are made up by, like living organisms. So coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds are all super important ecosystems here down in the Keys. And I appreciate the organisms for the creation of a habitat. They themselves are an organism, but they create this big ecosystem that so many other organisms live within, and I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, it definitely is. And you've worked on many different projects
Mhm.
already. Which project sparked your interest in continuing your path in this field?
So, I would say there's 2 that really got me into field ecology. The first was in my second year of undergrad. I was working for an anthropogenic fire lab. So, essentially, we would go out and light some prairies on fire for the name of science. We wanted to study the carbon sequestration that lighting fires helped with. This kind of comes from the idea that humans have evolved with fire for forever since we started walking the earth. But as we continued to industrialize and raise a civilized society, those natural processes like wildfires became a problem. Who wants to have their house burned down? I don't.
Mm,
But, fire is very natural in an ecosystem and it's necessary for kind of renewing an ecosystem or resetting it back to like square one. So that's kind of where I got started in my undergrad, but then it pivoted into being able to work with the project or the Kenya Long exposure experiment. And so I got to travel to Kenya and essentially work on a project where we were trying to understand the intensity or the frequency of fires. And then we'd cage an area after it had been burned to exclude certain mammals, depending on their body size.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, we would see who's coming to these areas after they've been burned to understand, is there a preference? Like, do animals like grass that has been regrown after a fire, and whether there's any correlation among that? So that was kind of like my first time getting an ecological field experience. And I remember talking to my professor after that and saying, like, wow, I really love, being out in the field and working in a team and working these long days with all of these different challenges. But I also remember saying, I don't think I could ever be a leader in this sort of situation. I was very early in my education career and didn't have a lot of confidence. But then later on in my third and fourth year of undergrad, I got to work for the Wildlife Conservation Society in Zanzibar, which is in Tanzania, so also East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But, there I got the opportunity to work with, the benthic monitoring team, and essentially what we were doing was we were going around the island of Zanzibar and taking pictures of, like, the ocean substrate to remap where all of the coral reefs were. That was for the, potential establishment of a no-take zone, so it was done in tandem with fisher surveys in the area to, have a more holistic idea of if there was an establishment of a no-take zone, what would be the implications for the fishing community.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was my first time really getting to work in the field, on a boat in conditions where you're getting stormed on all the time. And it's very intimidating, coming from a landlocked childhood to start working on the ocean. But I realized I
Yeah.
loved it. And here we are.
Yeah. The project sounds really interesting and important. What did happen after it? Did it help?
That's a good question. So I was part of, like one part of a small team on a much bigger project. So I currently do not work for the Wildlife Conservation Society anymore. So I don't know the status of where that all went. But from my understanding, I don't think that a no take zone has yet to be established. Um, Even if it would be established, it would take quite some years for that sort of thing to be in the works. You have to consult with a lot of stakeholders. So yeah, I'm not sure where that currently is at.
For corals, I think many people don't really know that they are
Mhm.
animals. And I think a lot of people also confuse sponges, corals, and plants. At least when I'm in the water and I'm trying to show people something and they're like, which one? What is it? And I'm like, They're the sponge. Like, what? Could you explain in simple terms what makes them different?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, corals and sponges are both sessile invertebrates, so they don't move and they don't have a backbone. Um, Sponges are just about as simple of an ancestor that you can get. So, in the way that like you and I share an ancestor through like apes and chimps, we as humans share ancestry with worms through the common ancestor of a sponge, which is really crazy. But sponges are super, super simple animals. They are animals, but they don't have any bones. They don't have a nervous system like you and I. But then if you're looking at corals versus sponges, sponges' main function within an ecosystem is providing a habitat, but filtering water is like the biggest, I guess, role that sponges probably have versus corals. And I can go into that more, but I know some of our other questions get more into the biology of corals and sponges. So essentially, what makes them different is sponges really filter water and corals don't.
Yeah. And what about plants?
Plants, yeah. So corals, I'm sure some people know, but maybe not everybody knows. Corals have a symbiotic relationship with a photosynthetic algae. So, what that means is they have a partnership with an algae, essentially. And for corals, that means that essentially 90% of their energy comes from the byproducts of photosynthesis from that algae. Um, some sponges actually have that too, which is really cool. Not all sponges, but some of them do. So plants, they're only there to produce, photosynthesis. They have chloroplasts, they have chlorophyll. Um, both sponges and corals can have relationships with algae, and algae is a type of plant. But on its own, a sponge cannot produce photosynthesis. And same thing for corals. On their own, they cannot produce photosynthesis. They need to have this relationship with a plant like algae to do that.
And I think the importance of corals has become clear to many people since they're often in the media. But what about the importance of marine sponges? How are they important for ocean health? And what role do they play that most people might not know about?
Yeah, so there definitely is growing interest around coral reefs and corals in general. Coral restoration, I would say, has become a pretty big buzzword anymore. But something that's not as known is sponges and sponge restoration. It's very common that I'm on a dive boat and somebody will come up from a dive and say, like, "Oh wow, I saw this bright purple coral down there, and it was in this tube, and it was kind of glowy, and it's so beautiful." And I was like, "You did see that, but it's not a coral, it's actually a sponge." They're like, "Oh, well, like, what's a sponge?" And then I go into my whole spiel. So, some pretty big benefits that sponges have within an ecosystem. I would say that there's kind of five off the bat. One, they're really important for coral attachment. So, a lot of sponges actually hold corals onto the reef. They're kind of like, a safety seatbelt in some aspects. Um, Not only are they gonna hold the live coral onto a reef, but they also hold dead coral or rubble. It's very natural to have dead rubble just rolling around on a reef. It's a habitat in and of itself, but it's not that great for living coral because who wants to be smacked with something constantly? It's not great for health. But sponges can actually hold that together to keep corals from being abrased, but also when corals spawn and they're looking for a place to settle on the reef, studies have shown that coral larvae actually prefer to settle on areas where there's rubble and sponges consolidated. Um, then I'm sure you have looked at your bath sponge or your dish sponge before and seen that there's a lot of holes in it, and that's very characteristic to sponges in general. And so we like to call sponges kind of living hotels. There's a lot of small spaces in there for organisms to crawl into and live in. So they're like a living hotel on the reef. Um, and then they are also food for spongivores or spongophiles on the reef. A big one is a hawksbill sea turtle. So if you are ever seeing hawksbill sea turtles on a reef, they're eating some sponges out there. And then last but certainly not least, I would say their primary importance is that they are filters on the reef. And so they are actively filtering and pumping water all of the time. And specifically, they're important because they clean the water in this way. So, they're taking in excess nutrients and viruses and bacteria, and they're taking it out of the water and sending it back out, cleaner.
That's how my fascination with sponges actually started. I was diving in the Mediterranean with some scientists,
Hmm.
and I was like, "What was that?" And they were telling me, "Yeah, it was a sponge, and it like cleans the water." And I
Yeah.
was like, "Really? That's so cool."
Yeah, they're really cool.
Yeah. And as you said, sponges and corals often live side by side, and you already told a little bit how they are helpful. But is there also a situation where they might not be so helpful? Do they sometimes grow too much over corals, maybe? Or what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's some kind of misconceptions around sponges in a reef environment. There are definitely very helpful interactions that sponges have. I just listed five. But there are also cases where sponges aren't, I guess, helpful in a way. So boring sponges are a sponge that, like grows into the rock, or in this case, it would be a coral skeleton. So under normal, like healthy reef circumstances, um, that's totally imbalanced. Every part of the ecosystem has its niche, its space that it's supposed to operate in. But as the climate changes, and specifically as waters become more nutrient, at least here in the Keys, we see a lot more of boring sponges. So sponges that are actually living into a coral skeleton. And so people have this perception that, like sponges are killing corals. And while there is some validity in that, I like to counter with, we've started to tip the scales of ecological balance, and there's a reason why this is happening. In a well balanced ecosystem, everything has its place, and boring sponges really are only found on, dead skeletons or rubble. So they're not competing, I guess, in the same way for space with corals. But now in ecosystems where we have tipped the scales, boring sponges have been given a competitive advantage, and so there is more of that interaction. Corals aren't able to survive as well, but some sponges are, and so there's the trade-off of one is stronger than the other. Um, but I don't want to say that and make it sound like sponges are all bad. They're not all bad. They're very necessary on the reef. And so, that you're well versed in some of the pros and cons of sponges on a reef. I don't normally bring that part up.
Yeah, we're switching back to a positive thing about sponges that you already mentioned a little bit, and you also had sent me a paper. Do sponges hold coral reefs together? Um, how exactly do they hold them together? How do they stabilize the coral heads and rubble?
Mhm. Yeah, so I sent you a paper by Dr. Janie Wolfe. She is a professor at FSU, Florida State University, and she's been doing sponge work for decades. And that paper in particular is researching sponge and corals in Panama. And essentially, what she ended up doing was arguing that sponges are essential for a reef ecosystem because after you remove all of the sponges from a coral reef ecosystem, you see a decrease in coral cover. So the results from her study actually show that sponges on a coral reef increase coral cover by an order of a magnitude, essentially by the power of 10. And I think the easiest way for me to explain how corals and sponges, like help each other on the reef would be using the example of the staghorn coral. So for the Caribbean, it's a Acropora cervicornis. They're a branching coral, and so they kind of grow up in a tree. There's like one stalk here, and it'll be kind of foliose and branch out. But the environment or the part of the reef that they live on is towards the top of the reef crest. So there's more wave action. There's more likelihood for an anchor or a diver to come by and kind of kick it. And since there's only one attachment point, it's pretty easy for it to break. Also, sometimes when they are able to grow enough, because there's only one point holding it up, it can collapse from its sheer weight. But sponges, part of what makes a sponge is a sponge and fiber, and that's, like, the very characteristic, texture. When you squish a sponge and you release it, it's going to release go back to its shape very quickly. And so when they grow together, you can think of it as, like, the staghorn corals, the Acropora cervicornis on a reef is kind of like the skyscrapers that we build in society. But skyscrapers need to be flexible in the same way that corals need to have kind of a flexible attachment as well. So, skyscrapers need to bend and sway with Earth's rotation and with wind and all of those things and able to stay upright. And so for corals, when waves are coming through and there's strong current that could knock them off the reef, when they have sponges holding on to them and attaching them to the reef, if there is any breakage, it's like a seatbelt. They were attached in one rigid way, but now there's a secondary attachment that's holding on and it can kind of bend and pull a little bit.
And when you were saying that corals break really easily, I mean, corals take a long time to grow. How about sponges? Do they grow faster? How long does it take to, I don't know, have a, a sponge that
Yeah.
size? Or
Yeah. So corals definitely take a while to grow. Like the massive reef building corals take
Mhm,
decades to reach substantial sizes, even like hundreds and hundreds of years. Um, Acropora corals or the more like branching corals, those are on a slightly faster timeline, but sponges
mhm,
can grow pretty quickly. So part of the work that we do now is based off of some research where they essentially took off a little bit of a sponge and then counted how long it took to regrow that exact amount.
mhm,
And so sponges can regrow in a matter of months. When we're holding them um, in tanks on land, or we've harvested a little bit for outplanting and we've put them like in our nursery, we can see sponges grow and attach to the things around them in a matter of couple days. So that's not the same as,
mhm.
like growing an entire appendage back in a day, but they'll grow that back in, I don't know, maybe 4 to 6 months. So that's really fast compared to corals.
Yeah. And what are the dangers for sponges? I mean, you said like turtles eat them, probably climate change. But what else are would be dangers for corals?
Yeah. So sponges.
Ah, sorry, for
No,
sponges.
you're
Yeah.
okay, yeah. So sponges are facing the same problems on a coral reef that corals are facing, temperature
Hmm.
increases, ocean acidification is an issue as well, and nutrient pollution. Um, there are such things as sponge diseases in the same way that stony corals have diseases. Sponges can also die from diseases. Um, and then, hmm, I mean, just like in the same way corals can be popped off or crushed by an anchor or a diver. It's very easy, to take off these creatures from the reef. And so when you're out there diving or snorkeling or you're on a boat, you really want to be careful and aware of the things that are underneath you as well.
How do corals benefit from the water being filtered by sponges or from the protection sponges give them against boring organisms?
Sure. So, um, one of the things I had mentioned before, like the benefits of a sponge in a coral reef ecosystem, was that
Hmm.
it filters a lot of water. It actively filters all of the time. And sponges are pretty cool because they're the primary filter for picoplankton. And picoplankton are like the smallest things that you're going to find in the water. So, your viruses and your bacteria, things that can make diseases and sickness in the ocean. And so, when you have a good population of sponges on a coral reef, they're going to be cycling out all of this excess nutrients and helping manage the extra viruses and bacteria in the water that could potentially make corals sick. So it's important to have both because if you want to have healthy corals, you need to help maintain a good water quality, and sponges are really big players in water quality. But regarding boring sponges, I know we had talked a little bit about how sponges can also be boring organisms, but sponges, when they're growing with corals, can sometimes protect like the undersides or the ledges of corals that would
Hmm.
otherwise be open to organisms like worms or encrusting clams, things like that that would pose as irritation. Um, but some sponges can grow, in a really like beneficial relationship. They're not encroaching on the coral, and the coral then has, an extra layer of protection underneath from these other organisms coming to settle.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like it's really important for the corals to have sponges
It
around.
is, yeah.
And there are so many different species of sponges out there. What are the differences between the different types of them? And how diverse are they in reef environments?
Yeah, so there are a couple thousand species of sponges out there, and I'm new to sponges, so I'm still learning about a lot of them. But basically they're divided into four different classes, and it's basically based on the skeletal structure and their spicules. Spicules are kind of like the bones in our body. That's the bones that sponges have, and so those are the classifications. And some sponges have spicules that are glass. Some are made of calcium carbonate. Some sponges don't have hard spicules at all. They only have sponge and fibers. Like the kind of squishy part. Um, But then another part of sponges, um, or like classes of sponges, are deep sea sponges. Sponges can be found in so many different environments. They're found in freshwater, they're found in saltwater, they're found in warm tropical water, they're found in the Arctic, and they're found in the deep sea. So, for such a simple animal that's been around for so long, that it's really surprising how many adaptations or like ecosystems they can exist in. Um, and then, like, how diverse are they in a reef environment? There's a lot of spaces on the reef that you and I don't necessarily know about, or cryptic spaces. And very often, sponges hide in those areas. And so you might see a lot of sponges like in the top of the reef that are very easy to spot. But look underneath some ledges. If you look inside holes, you're also going to find a variety of different sponge species in there as well. So you can find a lot.
Yeah, when I was diving also in the Mediterranean Sea, I dove into a cave and I switched my light on and it was so colorful. Sponges everywhere.
Mhm.
It's so beautiful and a lot of life on it as well.
They are so
And as you just said, sponges can grow in many different places. What do they need to grow or to become a sponge to live?
sure, yeah. So sponges want water. That is like the main thing that they need. They really
Yeah.
don't like being out of water. Yeah, the sponges that do have photosynthetic zooxanthellae do need sunlight, but the sponges that that you said you found in a cave, those sponges don't need sunlight. So really they need access to water, and water with some type of nutrients in them. I mean, they're gonna pull that in anyway themselves and pick out what they want.
And how do they reproduce? I've seen ones that they just drop down pieces of themselves and then a new one it grew. Is that always the case, or did I even see it right?
So, sponges are mainly clonal organisms. That means that they're essentially like exact replicates of themselves. You can cut off a sponge and move it somewhere else on the reef, and it's the exact same sponge. Um, so in that sense, a lot of sponge reproduction can be down to asexual reproduction. So, you don't need egg and sperm. But then there are also some sponges that are broadcast spawners. So one sponge might release eggs, the other might release sperm, and at the same time they'll meet in the water column and create a little bundle that'll settle somewhere else on the reef.
And what is your favorite sponge or the most fascinating one to you, weird one, beautiful one? And what makes them so interesting to you?
Okay, I have four sponges I want to talk about.
Okay.
So, my favorite sponges here in the Caribbean, there's two of them. So, it's Calispongia plicifera, and it's just like this really just eye-catching sponge. The best way I can describe it is it kind of looks like a neon light or a neon sign underwater. It like glows in a way. So you can find them in like blues and greens and pinks and oranges and reds. You can find them in so many different colors. But like when you shift your orientation for them, you'll see like other colors come out. And when you're underwater and you see a bright red shifting into a bright orange item, like you're gonna look again and see like, what the heck was that? So I really like those sponges just because they're so eye catching. But then my other favorite sponge down here in Keys is my Kaylee Blavis. It's called the orange icing sponge, and that in particular has a really good relationship with coral. Um, but then in terms of fascinating sponges, um, my my boss, Dr. Bobby Renfro Price, educated me on two really unique sponges that I had no idea about before her. The first one is a tree sponge. And, I've said already, sponges want to be in the water. And so the idea of a sponge being in a tree is initially like, what do you mean by that? But it's sponges that literally live 100 feet above like a river basin in Brazil. And they can live 100 feet above water because during rainy season, the freshwater inundation is quite drastic. And so the river can rise like 100 feet. And so part of the year they'll be underwater, but then part of the year they're not underwater. And it's fascinating that a sponge can survive without water because that's one of the main requirements to have a sponge. But those sponges in particular, like the ones that live in trees, they can hibernate in the same way that like bears hibernate in winter. They package themselves up in like an airtight package and can just wait out months until water comes back. So like that's crazy to me. I I never would have guessed an organism with no brain, no nerves, no skeletal system that doesn't move can survive such a drastic environment like that. Um, and then deep sea sponges are also incredible. Harp sponges are really cool. They look so different than most of the sponges you're going to see otherwise. They kind of look like a star and they have like appendages that come up. They kind of look like individually gnocchi mushrooms if you know what that is. I kind of a weird correlation there, but they live 18,000 feet beneath the sea surface. So
Wow.
incredibly deep in cold waters. There's no light, and they catch things drifting by in the water and dissolve them on their skin, essentially. So it's kind of like the way a spider catches things in their web. And so I think that's another really cool and interesting sponge.
Yeah, definitely all sounded really fascinating. And your second favorite, or the second one you said in your favorites, is also a sponge species that was mentioned in a coral reef study you had sent my way. Why is it so significant, especially in places like the Caribbean and the Florida Keys?
Sure, yeah. So Mycale laevis is a sponge that has been studied for its relationship with corals. Not all sponges necessarily like choose to be with corals, but this sponge species in particular has been seen to interact and modify the way a coral grows. And I think that's really cool. Like, I started out in coral, and the way you start identifying things in the field is like you just have to go on a lot of identification dives and do your
Mm.
best with shape and polyp size and things like that. Um, but when you're getting into modified shapes, then it's like, oh, what am I even looking at? And it turns out a sponge changed the way a coral ended up being shaped. And it's like
Hmm.
completely okay. They have a really great relationship. And that's the work that I'm trying to explore right now. So in the Florida Keys, we have had a significant loss of coral cover, like a lot of places in the Caribbean.
True.
Increasing effects of climate change has been hard um, on our coral cover. So I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure within the Florida Reef track, coral cover is less than 10% anymore. I wanna say even lower, maybe around 6%. And so that's
Mm.
that's sad, it hasn't always been that
Yeah.
way. And so maintaining our coral cover is a really big priority. But with all of these other changes going on a reef, and you're and people are putting corals back out there, we really want to give them the best chance possible. And so
Yeah.
I I think it's important for us to consider a more holistic approach to restoration and putting these corals back out there? Like, what can we mimic in nature to also add extra success to these coral outplants?
So, what's the idea behind using sponges as a secondary attachment method for coral outplanting? And why could it make restored reefs more successful?
Yeah, so using sponges as a secondary attachment method, um, I think could be a really exciting direction for coral restoration to go in because, as we had talked about before, sponges can grow faster than corals. Sometimes corals can take a couple of years or a couple of months, depending on the species when outplanting, for them to, like grow over what they've been outplanted on and really attach themselves to the reef. But in an environment that's, can sometimes be harsh and there's a lot of things threatening their health and their growth, um, I think it could be advantageous to add sponges are that have beneficial relationships with corals as a secondary attachment to really attach them just a little bit quicker. Um, it's still a new idea, but in a reef where we have so much less coral cover than we used to, a priority should be maintaining coral cover and specifically of the ones that we're putting out. And so I think secondary attachment methods through sponges could potentially increase the success of coral outplanting, but still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, definitely sounds something worth trying. Coral reefs cover less than 0.1% of the ocean, but they support about a quarter of all marine life. Why should people care about these ecosystems and the creatures living in them?
Yeah, so like you said, coral reefs cover a very small amount of the actual ocean. Um, but for such a small part of the ocean, it provides a lot of things for humans. And just even besides humans for an entire ecosystem. So, the statistic around 25% of all marine biodiversity is based off of a coral reef. That basically means that if we didn't have coral reefs, we would we could lose up to 25% of the organisms we find in the ocean because at one point or another they rely on a coral reef for their life. Um, then, I mean, if you want to look at the more human aspect of why do coral reefs matter, fisheries, 4 billion people in this world live within 50 miles of a coastline. And that's pretty significant for food sources and for economies. I mean, who doesn't want to make money and eat? I want to make money and eat. So if that means, relying on this ecosystem, it helps us then. Um,
Hmm.
and Why should we care about them? I mean, I think it's our duty as humans to take care of the environment because it gives so much to us. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that if there's something out there for us to take and to use, we should take and use it for our benefit. But I I hope that people continue to learn about these places and about nature that does give so much to us, but also understand that we have to do the work to keep these places healthy so they can continue to give us things that we need as well.
And recent sponges face so many threats from climate change to overfishing to pollution. From your perspective, what feels like the most urgent challenge right now?
That's a good question. And I think the answer can vary between a lot of different people. I think, a lot of things that I could say in terms of changing lifestyle, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for everybody. And not everybody has, the accessibility to make sustainable lifestyle changes. And so, keeping that in mind, I think a free and easily accessible thing that you can do to support ocean protection would be to support those who have dedicated their lives and their careers to the ocean, whether that be scientists or advocates or even politicians who continue to push for um, sustainable changes um, in our economies. Calling, your government representatives, showing up to protests, and maybe even just, showing some love and support for a scientist or somebody that you might see on TV or on social media that's doing a lot of this hard work. Um, having a basis of support in a time when not everybody wants to listen is really helpful for a lot of people who advocate for the ocean.
And you're part of the first large scale sponge restoration project that we know of. What excites you most about this project and what can you tell us about it?
Yeah. So, a lot of people end up asking me, how did I get into sponges? And I wasn't into sponges until this year. Um, but that's all thanks to my very good mentor, friend, and boss, Dr. Bobby Renfro Price. She's really been the inspiration behind my growing love and appreciation of sponges. Um, what excites me about this project is that it's it's new. We're working not we. She has been working on this for a long time in her PhD, trying to understand what is successful, what can we draw on from other methods of restoration to translate this into a successful sponge restoration program. And so it's really exciting, to see novel science happening. It's not something that, you necessarily get to partake in every day. I think a lot of early career scientists um, often can gain experience in organizations or programs where there's already like established methods that have been known to work. But what's so exciting about the work that I get to do with her is that we're still figuring a lot of this out. And all of our data is new data. Like, we're answering questions that nobody else has answers to either. And I find that just really exciting to be a part of that kind of solution and that kind of curiosity in the world. But also, I mean, like I had said in the beginning, I the reason I like sponges and corals, sessile invertebrates versus dolphins and sharks and things like that, is because I like ecosystems, like looking at entire ecosystems that we care about. And so being able to work in a restoration program is for me means getting to work on ecosystems that just matter so much to not only me for just like my happiness and my career, but just for the environment and for everybody around us. And yeah, I think that in and of itself is just really fulfilling.
It's definitely a really cool project that you get to be a part of there and yeah, do all of this new research. And I have some photos here that you sent me that we can take a look at, and maybe you can tell me a little bit about what we are seeing there.
Yeah.
So I think here we see a sponge working. What can you tell us about this
Yeah.
picture?
So this is Bobby, my boss. In her hand, she has a syringe that's filled with a marine dye. This dye is used in tracing like water contamination, especially in like drinking water. So it's safe to use in a marine environment. People are often a little worried about seeing that in the water. But what we're doing is we're putting this dye around a barrel sponge. And we're trying to demonstrate one of the really important functions that sponges have on a reef, which is filtration. And it's hard to understand the role of filtration on a reef because the water's already so clear. So how can we really visually conceptualize water being pulled in and put back out onto the reef? But a dye helps us actually visualize that. So what she did was she put a little bit of the dye all around the base of the sponge, and you just wait a couple seconds, and then you see it coming out the top. And so it's a really great visual representation of what sponges do all the time. They're constantly cleaning our water, sucking it in and shooting it back out.
That definitely looks amazing. At first glance, you're like, what is happening here? And yeah, it's wonderful to see what sponges can do. And here in the second photo, we have a coral nursery.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different coral nurseries that you can have. And this is just one version of it. This is a rope system.
Hmm. I think here we have a different rope system.
Yeah, another rope system. They're called verns. So they're vertical rope nurseries. So instead of laying horizontal, they instead go vertical.
And what are the benefits of one or the other?
It totally depends on the like the ecosystem and the corals. So this one is I think it's an inshore nursery, so it's in about 30 to 35 feet of water.
Hmm.
Acroporas, well, a lot of corals need to have light, and so they tend to be a little more towards the top, but 30 feet is still within the photic zone. So it really just depends on the the availability of what type of water is around a restoration organization. Like here in the Florida Keys, you have to go out 6 to 7 miles before you reach the reef. But if you're in more of like an atoll where the reef is closer to you and there's just like a short lagoon between you and the reef, and the lagoon is quite shallow, you don't need to have a 30-foot deep, a 30-foot long rope system. You can just hang them out horizontally instead.
Hmm. And here I think we have a close up of a sponge.
Yeah, this is a sponge. It's a sponge that's name is Monancra arbuscula. So big mouthful of a name, but I think it's just a really pretty sponge because it has this webbing on top of it.
Hmm. And what are the white particles on it?
The white particles, well,
Yeah.
the white lines are just part of the sponge, but
Yeah.
the particles are actually sediment. So, um, often when you're diving on a reef, it can often be really clear, but sometimes it's not as clear. Maybe there had been a storm or there's strong currents that's just, mixing up a lot of fine, um, sediments in the water. But when things calm down, they're gonna settle back onto what's ever down there. And on this sponge, it seems like either sediment has been settled on it, or even, as the sponge is pulling the water in, it might have kind of pulled in this light sediment as well.
Hmm. And what happens if too much sediment is stirred up for too long of a time? Can the sponge choke?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, sponges prefer to filter out picoplankton, so the smallest particle size that you can get. Um, in Like, so essentially, can sponges be smothered by sand? Yes, definitely. If you impair, you can kind of see all of the small little dots along the surface of the sponge there. They're called ostia, and those are the holes where all of the water is coming in. So if you block the sponge's ability to bring water in, you're essentially blocking its ability to eat as well. And so, yes, in times of storm or um, maybe even like an algae bloom when the water just becomes so thick with something else, and it's a larger particle size, it can block a sponge's ability to filter and thus eat.
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard of that from beach nourishments. If they took sand or rock that was too small, and then it suffocated the sessile animals
Hmm.
around since they couldn't really leave.
Yeah, you're right.
And what are we seeing here?
Yeah, so this is
Attached.
our sponge outplant. So within the Florida Keys, we kind of have some regulations that we have to operate within. We often get questions of why do you use this method of attachment versus something else? And it's because we're supposed to put down as natural of substances as we can. So essentially, the green part is a sponge. It's a sponge that's named Iotrichota biricillata, or the green finger sponge, and it's sitting on top of a coral skeleton. So it's a dead coral skeleton that we've collected, that was just, rolling around on the reef. And the reason we chose to put them on this coral skeleton is because they'll grow and attach to it. The sponges will grow and attach to it pretty happily. Um, the white stuff kind of at the bottom of the photo is a marine epoxy, and sponges do not like marine epoxy. They touch it and they're gonna shrivel up and they're gonna die and be like, oh, I don't want to touch that. So that kind of makes putting sponges down a little difficult. But then, of course, you have to attach the sponge to the skeleton. And so you can see some thin zip ties. Yeah, like really small, clear zip ties. But we actually remove those about a week after we put the sponges out because we're trying to reduce the amount of plastic that we have in the ocean. So we keep them there long enough to make sure that the sponge has readily attached to the skeleton and hopefully the reef. And then we can take the plastic off.
Can you reuse the zip ties as well?
Some of them we can. These ones we unfortunately are not able to. We do have reusable zip ties, but they're significantly thicker. And
Mm.
when we're putting them on organisms that are kind of small to begin with, we want to minimize the impact to their health. So,
Could
unfortunately.
you use like a rope or something, like a small one, a string
Yeah, we
instead?
we often get asked about like cotton or twine ropes, and I think that's a really good idea, but from my understanding is that it's just not approved within the sanctuary.
And I think here we're seeing something similar with a different sponge.
Mhm. Yeah, so if anybody would ever come out with eye care to outplant sponges, this is kind of the end product. At the end of the dive, you outplant in a cluster of a couple of sponges, and hopefully, eventually, they're all gonna grow together and help some other things on the reef. But that's the work that you do at the end of a restoration dive.
Beautiful. I feel like here we see a sponge between a coral.
Yeah, so, this is a sponge and a coral growing together, and, well, there's actually 2 types of coral in this photo, but I think it's really easy for people to see sponges and corals, especially in represented images like this and think, oh, they must be competing. And that's a fair thing to think about. But when you know about all of the extra added benefits of, sponge and coral interactions, um, having, a branching coral like this, have a flexible secondary attachment, I see it and it actually makes me really excited because in my minds, this coral is more resilient towards like wave action or maybe being kicked by a diver. It's more likely to stay on the reef because of the sponge.
Yeah, I think in this photo, I would more think that they're competing or wouldn't even realize that a sponge is also growing there with the coral.
Yeah, and I this is a sponge that I see very rarely in this morphology in this shape. Um, and So, part of the work that I do right now is trying to quantify sponge interactions with corals in a reef environment. And so, a lot of the time, I'm staring at those margins between the sponge and the coral, trying to figure out, like, okay, who's overgrowing who? And maybe they're not overgrowing, maybe they're growing in tandem. But yeah, you're right. Sometimes one can overtake the other.
Thank you so much for talking us through the photos. It was really interesting. And we're already at the last questions. If you could inspire listeners to do one thing that helps protect oceans, even something small in their daily lives, what would it be?
Understanding the effects that you can have far away from the ocean. You and I both grew up far away from the ocean. And so in my childhood, I didn't really understand that the actions that I have inland still affect the ocean. Um, Specifically, like I think of watersheds. I was part of the, Mississippi watershed. So it's huge, it covers a really big area of land, and then it puts it out into the Gulf of Mexico. Um, and I think there's a lot of behaviors or activities that humans could change to be more sustainable. But I think, especially in like the Florida Keys and knowing about the effects in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida Bay, um, understanding that what we do upstream does have downstream effects. So you might be far away from the ocean, but if you're polluting far away from the ocean, it'll still end up in the ocean.
Yeah,
The-
that's definitely something people have to think about. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with me and all the interesting information about sponges and corals. And I hope to have you on the podcast sometime again to talk about your new projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.